All right, what's going on, you guys? Welcome to another video. My name is Gerardo, creator of LookIntoHex.com, your premier quantitative and statistical experience for hex in the world. Subscribe if you're new, like the video if you like this hybrid quantitative, technical, qualitative, etc. analysis. Let's jump into the topic of this video. PulseX. There's been a lot of talk on the AMM Fixer Bot. Now, if you don't know what AMMs are, you probably have to go back into previous videos where I do an overview on PulseX. Some of those videos might still be labeled Pulse Swap. Some of my Pulse Chain slideshows give that same type of information and really dive deep into what an automated market maker is. The reason I bring that up is because it's important to understand what I'm going to be talking about in this video. It's a prerequisite, if you will. So this AMM Fixer Bot, there's been a lot of chatter about it, right? Some rough numbers thrown around. But I really want to illuminate the reason why this bot needs to exist in the first place. So again, touch roughly on the figures, touch on the rough figures that we're going to see in terms of minting supply, in terms of how much ether is there in DeFi, and does that ratio have value on the Pulse chain side, right? So I'll leave you with some questions at the end, but let's jump right into what I prepared for you guys here. Just a slight little slideshow. So motivation, right? Why in the first place? Well, the thesis is simple, right? Richard Hart said it himself, that he believes there exists some sort of value in the current liquidity pair ratios across the landscape of AMMs currently on Ethereum. What does that mean? It means after enough years of swapping back and forth, of trading your Ether for your USDC, for your Hex, for your DAI, over the years, people have swapped to a point where now the ratios or the prices are sitting at certain levels, right? And when you're talking in terms of AMM's ratios and prices, you're oftentimes saying the exact same thing, right? So again, go learn about AMMs. Otherwise, you will have no idea what I'm talking about in this video. So does there exist value in the current ratios? Sure, because it's taken the markets, the free market, which pretty much decides everything at the end of the day, in this ecosystem, it has decided that these are the prices, right? These are the ratios of ETH to USDC, again, a Hex to ETH, all of that good stuff. So assuming that these ratios in Uniswap, in SushiSwap, in PancakeSwap, assuming these ratios, well, I should really only touch on the ones on Ethereum, so scratch that PancakeSwap comment, but assuming all of the ratios on Uniswap, SushiSwap, etc., 0x, as long as you believe they have value, which I think they do, and again, I'd repeat for that simple reason that it's what the market has decided over years, well then that's your baseline. Now, assuming there is value in those ratios, well, you have to look at something like, what is the Pulse supply going to be relative to the current Ether supply? Again, it's all ratios. So if you look at the current Ether supply, it's about 119 million, roughly 120 million. And if we look at the math done on the Pulse supply, after bonuses, after 10,000x per sacrifice point initially, and then the curve tapering off, you pretty much arrive at roughly 150 trillion Pulse, right? Definitely between 100 and 200 trillion Pulse. So you're inflating the supply of this fork, of this new coin, by roughly 1 million x. To be more specific, about 1.2 million x or so. You can see here on the screen, 1.25 million x. Now, right, okay, so yeah, I was just reading the text there, but the reason that's important is because didn't we say there's value in the current ratio landscape across the Ethereum AMMs? And if that is so, and we are inflating the supply drastically by over 1 million fold, then something needs to give. You know what I'm saying? So at that point, you say, okay, well, it's unreasonable to have such thin order books after the fork. So something needs to be done about that. And therein comes in the AMM bot, because just a simple thought experiment, right? Let's say you're inflating the supply by roughly 1 million x, and let's say there's a pool of an amount of Hex backed by, let's say, 1,000 Ethereum, right? I have to do some math real quick. So let's say Hex is like 20 cents. Ethereum, let's say it's $3,000. So you have roughly 15,000 hex per Ethereum. So let's say someone has a position, right? A liquidity provider position on Uniswap V2 where you have to provide equal liquidity on each side. So let's say they have a hex Ethereum position and they just put it in today. And since they have to provide liquidity symmetrically, right? That means at current rates, they'd be putting in, let's say for one Ether, for every Ether they put in, they have to put in 15,000 hex. So if you're liquidity providing on the hex ETH pair and you have your one Ether to 15,000 hex, well, what happens to that, $6,000 position after the fork? Well, you have 15,000 hex, PRC20 version, right? P hex, cool. But now that's only backed by one PLS. And I know that the sacrifice rate should not be considered a price because it's rather a cost, right? Cost does not equal value. Point being, it still doesn't make too much sense, right? To have, 16 or 15,000 hex backed by a single pulse, right? That $6,000 position now becomes, well, again, I'm not saying the sacrifice rate was a price, but the initial sacrifice rate for PLS was 10,000 per dollar. So if there's only one PLS backing 16,000 or 15,000 hex, then you're looking at each hex being worth, 0.0001 divided by 16,000. I think that's even lower than the all-time low price. Yeah, so that doesn't make any sense, right? You have extremely, extremely thin order books based on hex being backed by something that's been inflated a million X. So you'd assume that some level of dilution happens in value after a million X inflation. So after all is said and done, something needs to give. And so you're like, all right, well, if there's value in the ratios that exist across the current landscape of Ethereum AMMs, let's just replicate that. So you arrive at this value that I found, right? It's really, really simple. You just go to Etherscan, looked up the wrapped Ether contract, WETH, W-E-T-H, and you find that there are roughly about 7 to 8, closer to 8 million Ether sitting in the wrapped Ether contract. And that tells you that about 6.5% of all of Ethereum is in the wrapped Ether contract. That more specifically tells you something along the lines of 6.5% of all Ether is in DeFi, right? It's sitting in Uniswap pools, for example, because you really only need, wrapped Ethereum, WETH, for to make. I'm not an expert here, but as far as I know, wrapped Ether is an ERC20 version of Ethereum because Ether itself isn't an ERC20. So it makes it easier to interact with contracts that take in ERC20s, that interact with ERC20s. So, for example, the Uniswap protocol, where you're trading ERC20s for each other. I believe they route through wrapped Ethereum instead of Ethereum itself. Pretty interesting. Point being, if 6.5% of all Ethereum is in the wrapped Ethereum contract, that leads you to be motivated to say, okay, what if 6.5% of all PLS is in the wrapped PLS contract, aka in the pools? So that leads you to say, well, let's mint enough pulse supply to fix these ratios. That's why it's called the AMM Fixer Bot, right? Ratio Fixer Bot. And something I kind of glossed over in this previous slide is this second to last bullet point, that prices on automated market makers, they change as a square of changes to one side of liquidity. What do I mean by that? Well, all it means is if you have 5 million hex being backed by $1 million, that's 20 cents per hex, right? If you add $1 million to the bid side, you've doubled one side, you cut the other side in half. So now you have 2.5 million hex being backed by $2 million. So you multiplied the price by 4. So now instead of having 20 cent hex, now you have 80 cent hex. So these are just rough numbers. Obviously the pools are bigger than that. So it'd take more than a $1 million purchase to send hex to 80 cents plus, right? I think we're looking closer to what is it, like 30 or 40 million dollars of liquidity. It's quite the liquid market, so it takes more than $1 million to quadruple price. But with that said, price does change as a square of one-sided changes to liquidity. Therefore, if you wanted to 1 million X prices of your PRC20s versus PLS because of SAT inflation, you would actually only need a square root of this 1 million X figure. So roughly speaking, you only need about 1,000 or 1,200 X ish to get this multiple in price. So we'll just say 1,000X, roughly speaking. So the assignment of this fixer bot is basically to mint enough pull supply to 1,000X the bid side liquidity on all the pairs, therefore multiplying the prices of all these PRC20s, 1 million X relative to PLS. And that's important. It's relative to PLS because PLS is the thing that's being inflated 1 million X, slightly more. So after that, this million X is the prices, again, of all PRC20 PLS pairs, denominated in PLS, like I said, on the Uniswap V2s, I say it plural, but for example, on Uniswap V2, on SushiSwap, on 0x, on all of these automated market makers that exist on Ethereum. So the ratios are being fixed and they're basically being emptied, if we're being real, because I pointed out, right? You have these really, really thin order books because of the fact that PLS is being inflated relative to the Ether supply. And so once you inject all of this PLS that was minted for this very purpose into these pairs, you're pretty much emptying them of all of their PRC20 liquidity of the majority, right? 90+%, leaving any previously existing LP positions, right? If you're currently positioned as an LP on Ethereum in any pair, on Uniswap V2, for example, your coins will be harvested. And if you had, like I said, we'll use the same example. If you have a position on Uniswap V2, an LP position, you would call it, of 15,000 hex and 1 ether, then after you're harvested, right, that 15,000 hex being backed by a single PLS after the fork will now be 1,000 times less hex. So 15 hex now backed by 1,000 PLS. Now you see things start happening. So let me do the math on that actually. 15 hex. What is that? 20 cents? $3. Backed by, what did I say? 1,000 PLS. Interesting. So that would, assuming hex is 20 cents over there as well, then that would make PLS about 1/3 of a penny. But what's interesting about that is it's basically circular math, right? The way you arrive at that 1/3 of a penny is actually super, super, super simple. It's dividing the Ethereum price by 1 million. And that just assumes that PLS upon launch as a network, Pulse Chain, will be as valuable as Ethereum. So if you use that assumption, then you'll get to these numbers, right? But the point being, any existing LP position that currently exists, for example, on Uniswap V2, like I said, a hex ETH position where you have 15,000 hex and 1 ETH, right? A $6,000 position after the fork on Uniswap V2, you'll really be left with just like 15 hex on that side and about 1,000 PLS. So yeah, that'll be harvested and injected into PulseX, the premier DEX experience on Pulse Chain, most liquid AMM as well. And that's a really important point, right? Because you're harvesting, you're emptying all of these other AMMs of their liquidity, of their PRC20s, injecting them into PulseX, and you're centralizing liquidity. I think the crypto space is mature enough to know that just centralization as a term itself isn't the worst thing in the world, right? Certain things like ownership, centralization is kind of good for price. Liquidity, centralization is kind of good for market execution, right? If you want to get the best deal on an AMM, you're going to want to use an aggregator, truly, something like 1inch.io, if that's available to you. So something like a 1inch.io aggregator will become unnecessary at the beginning of PulseX because of this liquidity aggregation mechanism where, again, something like 1inch just says, oh, look at all these AMMs, look at this liquidity fractionation, kind of a problem. Let me get you the best deal and not make an arbitrage bot rich by making you the arbitrage bot by getting a little from here, a little from here, a little from here, a little from here, versus getting all of it from here, pumping the price on one exchange, an arbitrage bot, or someone sees that, usually a bot, and say, oh, it's expensive there. I'm just going to buy up here, sell here, buy here, sell here, buy here, sell here, until they reach parity, right? And if you just use centralized liquidity and you don't have your liquidity fractionated, again, it's a problem. Liquidity fractionation is not a good thing. Then centralized liquidity is awesome, right? Something like PulseX. It's really smart, actually, right? This AMM bot is fixing ratios. It's preventing existing liquidity providers from just pulling all of the liquidity and not letting the game be played, right, on Pulse Chain. You are bringing over all of the action to your exchange, where the incentives are bridging over your ERC20s, pair them up here, back the value of what you got for free with what you had anyways and you liked and were holding anyways, right? And a lot of cool things. The overall review here of PulseX is it's pretty simple. I think I've covered this before, but the real coverage of this video was the AMM Fixer Bot, right? But PulseX is going to be cool, man. The buy and burn feature is just a potential, right? No expectations, but you can just watch what this fee2 address does that receives roughly 21% of all fees, aka 0.06% of every single trade. Let's watch and see what it does. Hopefully it does something benevolent to PLSX. But in the meantime, the things that are certain are things like, well, the yield on PulseX will be in Pulse plus a new inflationary token, more specifically speaking, 0.22% of all trading fees in PLS plus that new inflationary token. And PulseX holders will control the DAO that determines basically interest rates across these trading pairs. So that's just a basic overview, right, of the AMM Fixer Bot, the motivation to why you'd want it in the first place, how it's all kind of going to work out, some figures that I mentioned for you there, and then just an overall kind of bird's eye overview of PulseX, because the AMM bot is, again, for all the AMMs on Ethereum, and to basically prime PulseX and curate it to become the premier DEX experience on Pulse Chain. You can swap, stake, LP, yield farm, etc. That's been your video. I don't want to make it too long, take too much of your time. I appreciate you watching. Leave a thumbs up if you enjoy this kind of content on Hex, Pulse Chain, PulseX, and so on. The goal is to make more videos. So I hope you appreciated this. I appreciate you watching, and I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace.